The rich kid was still laughing about the clueless old mechanic when he noticed the faded photograph hanging behind the cash register. A group of men in pristine white coats standing beside the very first Ferrari F40 prototype. And there in the center, 40 years younger but unmistakably recognizable, was the same man he had just called an incompetent fossil. Antonio Benedetti, Chief Design Engineer, Ferrari SPA, 1978 to 2015. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Tony's Auto Repair, a humble garage tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store in the working-class neighborhood of East Hartford. The building itself looked like it had seen better decades. Faded paint peeling from brick walls, a hand-painted sign that read, "Honest work, fair prices," in letters that had been touched up so many times they resembled a patchwork quilt of different blues and whites. Inside the cluttered office, 73-year-old Antonio Benedetti sat hunched over a desk covered in invoices, parts catalogs, and coffee-stained repair estimates, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose as he calculated the cost of a transmission rebuild for Mrs. Patterson's ancient Honda Civic. His hands, permanently stained with 40 years of grease and motor oil, moved carefully across the keyboard of a computer that was older than some of his customers, pecking out numbers with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned technology late in life but refused to be defeated by it. Antonio had opened Tony's Auto Repair 15 years ago, after what he euphemistically called his retirement from his previous career. The transition from designing million-dollar supercars to fixing neighborhood vehicles had been jarring at first, but he had come to appreciate the honest simplicity of the work. Here, success was measured not in horsepower or top speed, but in whether Mrs. Patterson could get to her doctor's appointment on time, and whether teenage Tommy Rodriguez could afford to keep his first car running on a part-time job at the local pizza shop. The neighborhood had embraced him slowly but completely. They knew him as Tony, the Italian immigrant who worked harder than men half his age, who never overcharged for parts, who would stay late to finish a job when someone desperately needed their car for work the next morning. They knew he had an accent that grew thicker when he was frustrated, that he made the best espresso this side of Milan using a machine he had brought from the old country, and that he had pictures of grandchildren he saw only twice a year when they visited from Italy.
What they didn't know, what nobody in this blue-collar corner of Connecticut suspected, was that Antonio Benedetti had spent 37 years as one of the most celebrated automotive engineers in the world, that his signature was etched into the design patents of some of the most beautiful and powerful cars ever created, and that his retirement from Ferrari had made headlines in automotive magazines across 3 continents. The thunderous roar of a high-performance engine interrupted Antonio's morning calculations, growing louder as it approached the garage. Through the grimy window he could see a gleaming red Ferrari F8 Tributo pulling into a small parking lot, its pristine paint job reflecting the morning sun like liquid fire. The car was worth more than most of his customers made in 5 years, and it stood out in his working-class neighborhood like a diamond in a coal mine. Antonio set down his reading glasses and walked outside, wiping his hands on a shop rag that had seen better days. The Ferrari's engine settled into the distinctive idle that he recognized immediately, the carefully tuned symphony of 8 cylinders that he had helped orchestrate decades earlier, when the basic engine architecture was still taking shape in the design studios of Maranello. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Marcus Wentworth, a 22-year-old whose entire demeanor screamed privilege and entitlement. He was tall, lean in the way that comes from expensive personal trainers rather than physical labor, and dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than Antonio's monthly rent. His hair was perfectly styled with products that came in tiny, expensive bottles, and his watch, a limited edition Rolex, caught the sunlight as he checked the time with the impatience of someone who had never waited for anything in his life. Marcus looked around the modest garage with barely concealed disdain, taking in the cracked concrete, the cluttered work bays, and the handwritten signs advertising services like "Oil Changes $29.99" and "We fix what others can't." This was clearly not the kind of establishment where his Ferrari was supposed to be serviced, but his regular dealership was booked solid for 3 weeks, and he needed an immediate repair for a minor electrical issue that was causing his car's infotainment system to malfunction. "Are you the owner?" asked Marcus as Antonio approached, his tone carrying the kind of casual dismissiveness that wealthy people often used when addressing service workers. "Yes, I am Tony," Antonio replied, his Italian accent wrapping around the English words like a familiar embrace. "How can I help you?"
Marcus gestured toward his Ferrari with the air of someone presenting a precious artifact to a museo curator. "I need this looked at. There's something wrong with the electronics. My usual place can't see me for weeks, so I thought maybe you could take a quick look. Think you can handle something like this?" The question was loaded with condescension, the implication being that a small neighborhood garage couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated engineering of a modern Ferrari. Antonio, who had personally overseen the development of the electronic systems Marcus was complaining about, simply nodded. "I can take a look," he said quietly. "What seems to be the problem?" Marcus rolled his eyes slightly, as if explaining technical issues to a simple mechanic was beneath him. "The infotainment system keeps freezing, and sometimes the car won't recognize my phone for Bluetooth connectivity. It's probably something simple, but I don't have time to deal with it myself." As Marcus spoke, Antonio was already conducting a visual inspection of the vehicle, his experienced eyes noting details that would be invisible to most people. He could see that the car had been driven hard, not abused, but pushed to its limits by someone who understood its capabilities. The brake discs showed the telltale signs of track use. The tires were wearing in patterns consistent with aggressive cornering, and the exhaust tips had the subtle discoloration that came from sustained high RPM operation. Despite himself, Antonio felt a surge of professional pride. This was how these cars were meant to be driven, not as garage queens or status symbols, but as the precision instruments of speed and engineering excellence they had been designed to be.
"Beautiful car," Antonio said, running his hand along the side panel with the reverence of someone who understood the countless hours of wind tunnel testing and computer modeling that had shaped every curve. Marcus snorted. "Yeah, well, it should be for what I paid for it. My father bought it for my birthday last month. Cost him 300 grand. The casual mention of such an enormous sum of money, delivered with the nonchalance of someone ordering coffee, would have impressed most people. But Antonio had worked in a world where $300,000 was considered a reasonable starting point for a serious automotive project, where individual components sometimes cost more than most people's cars. "Your father has good taste," Antonio said diplomatically. "He has expensive taste," Marcus corrected, "though honestly, I'm starting to wonder if it was worth it. Between this electronic problem and the way the dealership service department treats you like you should be grateful to give them money, I'm thinking maybe I should have gone with a Lamborghini instead." Antonio nodded politely, though internally he was amused by the idea that a Lamborghini would somehow be more reliable, or that its dealership network would be more accommodating. The young man clearly understood cars only as status symbols and performance statistics, with no appreciation for the engineering artistry that made them possible. "Let me get my diagnostic equipment," Antonio said, walking toward the garage.
"Just try not to scratch it, Grandpa," Marcus called after him, pulling out his phone to check his social media while he waited. "I don't think your insurance would cover replacing the paint job on something like this." The words stung more than Antonio let show, not because they were particularly cruel, but because they reduced a lifetime of achievement to the assumptions of a privileged child who saw only a grease-stained old man in a humble garage. Marcus had no way of knowing that the grandpa he was dismissing had personally overseen the development of the paint technology that gave his Ferrari its distinctive finish, or that the insurance on Antonio's knowledge and experience had once been worth more than the car itself. Antonio connected his diagnostic computer to the Ferrari's onboard systems, his fingers moving with practiced ease across interfaces that most mechanics would find intimidatingly complex. The problem revealed itself quickly: a software conflict between the car's native systems and an aftermarket phone app that Marcus had installed, exactly the kind of issue that Antonio had predicted and designed safeguards against during the development process. The fix took 15 minutes and required nothing more than a simple software reset that restored the factory settings. As Antonio worked, Marcus wandered around the garage, clearly bored and checking his phone every few seconds. He made snide comments about the ancient equipment and outdated repair manuals, unaware that some of those manuals contained technical specifications that Antonio had written himself. It was while Marcus was particularly engaged in composing what appeared to be a dismissive social media post about having to use a sketchy local garage that he wandered closer to the office area and noticed the photograph hanging behind the cash register. The image was faded with age, its colors muted by years of exposure to fluorescent light and cigarette smoke from the previous tenant. It showed a group of men in pristine white laboratory coats standing around what was unmistakably the first Ferrari F40 prototype, one of the most legendary supercars ever created. The men in the photograph were clearly engineers or designers, their faces bright with the pride of people who had just accomplished something extraordinary.
Marcus studied the photograph with idle curiosity, trying to make out the details despite the fading. The car in the image was obviously significant. Even he recognized the distinctive lines of the F40, a model that commanded millions of dollars at auction and was considered by many to be the pinnacle of automotive achievement. And there, standing in the center of the group with his hand resting proudly on the car's hood, was a man whose face was unmistakably familiar despite being 40 years younger. The same deep-set eyes, the same strong jaw, the same distinctive nose. It was Tony, the mechanic who was currently diagnosing his car's electronics system. Marcus blinked hard, certain he was seeing things. He moved closer to the photograph, squinting at the small placard beneath it that he hadn't noticed before. The text was in both Italian and English. Ferrari F40 Development Team, Maranello, 1987. Chief Design Engineer, Antonio Benedetti. The world seemed to stop moving. Marcus read the placard 3 times, looked back at the photograph, then turned to stare at Antonio, who was still bent over the Ferrari's open hood with the focused concentration of someone who understood every component he was looking at. Antonio Benedetti. Not Tony the local mechanic, but Antonio Benedetti, a name that Marcus suddenly recognized from automotive documentaries, magazine articles, and the kind of coffee table books about exotic cars that filled his father's study. This wasn't just any engineer. This was the man who had designed some of the most celebrated Ferraris of the modern era, whose innovations had influenced every supercar manufacturer in the world. Marcus felt his knees go weak as the implications crashed over him. The clueless old mechanic he had been mocking was actually one of the most respected automotive engineers in history. The man he had called Grandpa and warned not to scratch his paint job was the same person who had overseen the development of the paint technology itself. The humble garage owner he had been condescending toward probably forgotten more about Ferrari engineering than Marcus would ever learn. "Holy shit," Marcus whispered.
Antonio looked up from his work, raising an eyebrow at the sudden outburst. "Something wrong?" Marcus pointed at the photograph with a trembling hand. That's you in that picture, with the F40. Antonio glanced at the photograph and nodded casually. "Yes, that was a long time ago." "You're Antonio Benedetti, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. You designed my car. I helped design your car, Antonio corrected, with the modesty of someone who had always worked as part of a team. Many people contributed to making it what it is. Marcus felt like he was drowning in embarrassment. Every condescending comment, every dismissive gesture, every assumption he had made about this man now seemed monumentally ignorant and insulting. He had treated a living legend like an incompetent amateur, mocked one of the greatest automotive minds of the modern era as if he were some random garage worker who had gotten lucky enough to touch a real Ferrari. I had no idea, Marcus stammered. I thought you were just a mechanic? Antonio asked, not unkindly. I am a mechanic. I have always been a mechanic. Sometimes I design cars. Sometimes I build prototypes. Sometimes I fix what other people have broken. The work is different, but the love of the machine is the same. Antonio returned to his diagnostic work, but Marcus couldn't let the moment pass. Why didn't you tell me who you were? Why are you working here instead of, I don't know, consulting for major manufacturers or running your own design firm?
Antonio straightened up, wiping his hands on his shop rag as he considered the question. When I retired from Ferrari, I had offers to do exactly what you describe. Big money, prestigious projects, my name on the letterhead of consulting firms. But I had spent 37 years in boardrooms and wind tunnels and testing facilities, designing cars for people who could afford to spend more on a vehicle than most families make in a lifetime. He gestured around the modest garage. Here, I fix cars for people who need them to get to work, to take their children to school, to visit sick relatives in the hospital. Mrs. Patterson, who owns that Honda Civic over there, is a nurse who works double shifts to support her disabled son. Tommy Rodriguez saves every penny he makes at the pizza shop to keep his car running so he can get to community college. These people don't care about 0 to 60 times or top speed. They care about reliability, affordability, and honest service. Marcus listened in stunned silence as Antonio continued. I designed beautiful cars for the wealthy. Now I make reliable cars affordable for the working class. Both are important, but only one helps people live better lives. The simplicity and dignity of the explanation made Marcus feel even smaller. Here was a man who had reached the absolute pinnacle of his profession, who could have spent his retirement being celebrated and consulted and paid enormous sums for his expertise, instead choosing to use his skills in service of people who could never afford the cars he had once created. Your car is fixed, Antonio said, disconnecting his diagnostic equipment. The problem was a software conflict caused by an app on your phone. I've reset the system to factory settings, and everything should work properly now. Marcus nodded numbly, still processing the revelation. How much do I owe you? $50 for the diagnostic work. $50? Marcus couldn't hide his astonishment. That's it? Do you know what the dealership would have charged for this?
Antonio smiled. Probably 10 times as much, and they would have kept your car for 3 days to make it seem more complicated than it was. Marcus pulled out his wallet, his hands still shaking slightly. Instead of the $50 Antonio had requested, he pulled out $500 bills and placed them on the workbench. I can't accept this, Antonio said, trying to hand back the excess money. Please, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. It's not for the repair. It's an apology for the way I treated you, for the assumptions I made, for being exactly the kind of spoiled rich kid who doesn't deserve to drive a car you designed. Antonio studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse and something that might eventually grow into wisdom. Keep your money, he said finally. But promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll remember this feeling the next time you meet someone whose story you don't know. Everyone you encounter knows something you don't, has experienced something you haven't, has overcome challenges you can't imagine. The mechanic, the waitress, the janitor, the bus driver. All of them have stories that might surprise you if you're humble enough to listen. Marcus nodded solemnly. I promise. As Marcus drove away in his Ferrari, running perfectly now, thanks to the man he had insulted, he found himself thinking not about the car's performance or the envious looks it attracted, but about the lesson he had learned in a humble garage in East Hartford. The greatest expert on his car wasn't working in a gleaming dealership or a high-tech facility, but in a modest repair shop where he chose to use his extraordinary skills to help ordinary people.
Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself returning to Tony's auto repair, not because his Ferrari needed service, but because he had developed a fascination with watching Antonio work. He saw how the older man approached each vehicle with the same care and attention he had once devoted to multi-million-dollar prototypes, how he explained problems to customers with patience and respect, how he took pride in giving people reliable transportation at prices they could afford. Marcus began volunteering at the garage on weekends, initially just sweeping floors and organizing parts, but gradually learning the basics of automotive repair from one of the world's greatest experts. Antonio taught him not just about engines and transmissions, but about the dignity of honest work, the satisfaction of solving problems with his hands, and the joy of helping people who genuinely needed help. The story of their meeting spread through automotive enthusiast communities, shared and reshared on social media, as a reminder that expertise doesn't always announce itself, that legends sometimes choose humility over recognition, and that the most valuable lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers. Marcus's father, initially puzzled by his sudden interest in automotive repair, eventually visited the garage himself. When he met Antonio and learned his story, he offered to invest in expanding the business to help bring Tony's Auto Repair to the kind of facility that would better reflect Antonio's expertise. But Antonio politely declined, explaining that the garage was exactly the size it needed to be to serve its community effectively. Years later, when Marcus had graduated from college with a degree in mechanical engineering and was working for a major automotive manufacturer, he would still stop by Tony's Auto Repair whenever he was in town. The photograph of the Ferrari F40 development team remained behind the cash register, but it had been joined by other pictures. Marcus's graduation, the garage's anniversary celebrations, the community appreciation dinner where Antonio had finally been recognized for his contributions to the neighborhood.
But perhaps the most meaningful addition was a small framed note from Mrs. Patterson, thanking Antonio for keeping her Honda Civic running reliably for over a decade, enabling her to provide for her son without the stress of unreliable transportation. Because in the end, Antonio Benedetti had learned that the most beautiful cars weren't necessarily the fastest or most expensive. They were the ones that helped people live better lives. And every time Marcus looked at his Ferrari, he remembered not its top speed or its pristine engineering, but the moment when a humble mechanic taught him that greatness doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It reveals itself through service, kindness, and the quiet dignity of work well done.